The grand hall of Concordia Prime glowed with the light of 1,000 floating crystals, and delegates from across the galaxy had gathered to witness what they believed would be a historic moment of peace. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the center of the chamber, her dark hair pulled back in a formal style, her diplomatic robes carrying the blue and silver colors of the United Human Federation. She had worked for 3 years to reach this moment, and her heart swelled with pride as she looked around at the assembled representatives of dozens of alien species. Humanity had joined the Galactic Council only 83 years ago, making them newcomers by the standards of civilizations that measured their histories in tens of thousands of years. Yet humans had earned respect through their rapid advancement and their genuine desire for cooperation with other species. Across from Elena stood High Sovereign Zethal the Eternal, ruler of the Velkari Dominion. He towered over her by nearly 2 feet, his insectoid body covered in gleaming black chitin that reflected the chamber lights like polished armor. His 4 arms were folded in the traditional posture of diplomatic respect, and his compound eyes watched her with an expression that humans had learned to read as approval. The Velkari had ruled 12 star systems for over 10,000 years, and they considered themselves the true masters of this region of space. Their empire had existed when humanity was still learning to make fire, and they never let anyone forget this fact. But today they had agreed to share, and that was what mattered. High Sovereign Zethal, Elena spoke clearly so her words would carry through the chamber. On behalf of the United Human Federation, I am honored to finalize the Taetti Accord. She lifted the ceremonial document, its surface glowing with quantum-encoded text that could never be forged or altered. This treaty represents our shared commitment to peace and mutual prosperity in the Outer Veil territories. Zethal's mandibles clicked in what humans had learned was the Velkari equivalent of a smile. Ambassador Vasquez, his voice came through his translator as a deep rumble. The Velkari Dominion welcomes humanity as partners in the harvest of the Outer Veil's resources. He extended one of his upper claws toward her. Let this accord bind our peoples in trust and cooperation for generations to come. Elena reached out and clasped his claw in her hand, feeling the cool hardness of his chitin against her skin. The chamber erupted in applause and clicks and whistles, and all the various sounds that different species used to express approval. She smiled, genuinely happy, thinking of how she would call her family on New Geneva tonight to share the good news. Her daughter Maria was turning 7 next week, and Elena had already requested leave to attend the birthday celebration. Her husband Thomas had promised to record everything, so she would not miss a moment, even if diplomatic duties delayed her return. Little did she know that she would never see any of them again. 12 hours later, Elena was still on Concordia Prime, attending the formal celebration dinner that followed treaty signings. She was laughing at a joke told by the Rillian ambassador when her communication device began to vibrate with emergency alerts. At first she ignored it, thinking it was merely a scheduling update. Then every human device in the room began to sound alarms at the same time. Elena pulled out her communicator and felt her blood turn to ice as she read the words scrolling across the screen. New Geneva was under attack. Velkari warships had appeared in orbit without warning and had begun bombarding the colony from space. But they were not targeting military bases or defense installations. They were targeting hospitals and schools and residential areas. They were targeting children. Elena looked up from her device and found High Sovereign Zethal watching her from across the room. His compound eyes showed no surprise, no concern, no remorse. He had known. He had known the entire time. The handshake, the pretty words about partnership, the ceremonial document she still held in her other hand, All of it had been a lie designed to keep humanity distracted while his fleets moved into position. "You," Alina's voice came out as a whisper at first, then rose to a scream that silenced the entire chamber. "What have you done?" Zethal's mandibles clicked in that horrible smile again. "We have done what should have been done decades ago," he answered calmly. "We have reminded humanity of its place in this galaxy. You are newcomers here, Ambassador, and you have forgotten that newcomers do not demand equal standing with their betters. The Velkari Dominion has ruled these stars since before your species learned to walk upright, and we will not share our birthright with mammals who arrived yesterday." Alina lunged toward him, but was held back by security officers from 3 different species. "There are children on those worlds," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Innocent children who have done nothing to you." "Precisely," Zethal replied, and his voice held no emotion at all. "We are not merely defeating humanity today. We are sending a message that will echo through your history forever. You will remember this day, and you will remember your place." Over the next 72 hours, the full scope of the attack became clear. 7 human colony worlds had been struck simultaneously, and the Velkari had not targeted military assets at all. They had specifically attacked civilian centers, choosing locations where casualties would be highest and defenses would be lowest. Hospitals full of the sick and injured, schools full of children, housing complexes where families slept peacefully believing they were protected by treaties and laws. The final death toll reached 2.3 billion human beings. Among them were Thomas Vasquez, age 41, teacher of elementary school history on New Geneva, and Maria Vasquez, age 6, who would never see her 7th birthday. Ambassador Alina Vasquez received the news while still in custody on Concordia Prime, surrounded by alien security forces who were supposedly protecting her from Velkari assassins. She did not scream or cry when she learned her family was dead. She simply sat in silence, staring at the wall, her face completely empty of expression. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session and issued statements of deep concern and calls for measured diplomatic response. They urged humanity to seek justice through proper legal channels and to avoid escalating the conflict through military retaliation. They spoke of peace processes and negotiation frameworks and the importance of maintaining galactic stability. Humanity listened to all of this. And then humanity went completely and utterly silent. No threats, no demands, no declarations of war, no fleet movements, no angry speeches from political leaders. Just silence. The Velkari celebrated their victory and mocked humanity as cowards who had learned their lesson. They had no idea what was coming. 3 months had passed since the massacre, and the galaxy watched humanity with growing confusion. Every expert had predicted immediate retaliation, massive fleet engagements, orbital bombardments of Velkari worlds, perhaps even attempts at complete extinction of the enemy species. This was how wars worked in the galaxy, and this was how every other species had responded to attacks throughout recorded history. But humanity did none of these things. Human diplomats continued to attend Galactic Council meetings, with polite smiles on their faces. Human trade ships continued their routes through neutral space. Human colonies rebuilt their defenses quietly without any aggressive posturing. The Velkari High Command grew first confused, then amused, then openly contemptuous. "They are broken," High Sovereign Zethal declared to his war council. "The mammals have learned that they cannot stand against the might of the Dominion. Their spirits are crushed, and they will never again challenge our supremacy." His generals clicked their mandibles in agreement and laughed at human weakness. They could not have been more wrong. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a bunker that did not officially exist, Fleet Admiral James Okonkwo convened the most secret meeting in human history. The room was filled with people from every field imaginable, and not a single journalist or politician knew this gathering was taking place. There were military commanders and intelligence officers, as one would expect. But there were also economists and psychologists, hackers and artists, historians and anthropologists, experts in alien cultures and specialists in information warfare. Admiral Okonkwo stood at the front of the room, his dark face carved with lines of grief and exhaustion. He had lost a son on Colony 7, a young naval officer who had been home on leave when the attacks came. But his voice was steady as he addressed the assembled experts. "We are not here to plan a war," he began, and confusion rippled through the room. "We are here to plan something far more complete than war." He pressed a button, and holographic images of Velkari civilization appeared in the air above them. "For 3 months we have been silent because we have been learning. We have studied our enemy not just as soldiers study opponents, but as doctors study diseases. We know their fleet strengths and their military tactics, yes, but more importantly, we now understand their society." He gestured to a woman in civilian clothes, who stepped forward to address the room. Dr. Sarah Chen was the leading human expert on Velkari culture, and she had spent the last 90 days barely sleeping as her team analyzed every piece of information humanity had ever gathered about the insectoid species. "The Velkari are a hive-structured species," she explained, "but not in the way most people think. They are individuals with their own thoughts and desires, but their entire civilization depends on a single interconnected system called the Nexus Mind." Images of vast technological networks appeared in the holographic display. The Nexus Mind is a quantum-linked network that controls everything in Velkari society. Their economy runs through it, their communications pass through it, their military takes orders through it, even their biological reproduction cycles are managed by systems connected to it. Without the Nexus Mind, the Velkari cannot function as a civilization. Their ships cannot fly, their doors cannot open, their money has no value, their very ability to reproduce as a species depends on technological chambers regulated by this network. Admiral Okonkwo nodded grimly. "We have discovered their greatest weakness, and it is not their military. It is their dependency on this single system. The Velkari believe they are invincible because they have the largest fleet in this region of space. They have never considered that someone might attack not their ships, but their entire way of life." He turned to face the room with fire in his eyes. "Today we begin Project Seizure. Our goal is not to destroy the Velkari Dominion. Our goal is to take complete control of it." Over the following weeks, thousands of the most skilled humans in dozens of fields began working on the most ambitious operation in the history of their species. Teams of programmers created artificial intelligence constructs designed to infiltrate Velkari systems without detection. These AI programs were unlike anything that had been built before, capable of hiding within the Nexus Mind for months while slowly spreading through every connected system. Intelligence operatives identified sympathetic individuals within Velkari society, reformers and dissidents who had long opposed the Dominion's brutal policies but had been too afraid to act. These brave souls provided access points and insider information that made the infiltration possible. Legal experts compiled evidence of every war crime committed during the attacks, gathering testimony and recordings and documents that would prove the massacre was premeditated and approved at the highest levels. Economists mapped every flow of money and resources within the Dominion, identifying which systems were most critical to their continued operation. Psychologists studied Velkari behavior patterns to predict how they would react when they discovered what had happened to them. And through it all, Ambassador Elena Vasquez watched and contributed and waited. She had been given a new role and a new code name, and the grief that had nearly destroyed her had transformed into something cold and hard and infinitely patient. They called her widow, and she had devoted every moment of her existence to ensuring that those who murdered her family would face justice. Not revenge, she told herself every morning, justice. There was a difference, and that difference mattered. The Velkhari would not be exterminated, as they had tried to exterminate humanity. They would be held accountable, and they would be changed, and they would never again threaten anyone. The operation proceeded in total secrecy for month after month. Human infiltration programs spread through the Nexus mind like a slow and patient infection, copying themselves into every system, recording every communication, mapping every connection. The Velkhari never detected them because the programs were designed to be completely invisible, drawing no more power than natural system noise. Meanwhile, human diplomats continued to smile and attend meetings and speak of healing and moving forward. Several Velkhari officials actually apologized to human representatives for the attacks, expressing confidence that humanity had learned its lesson and would now accept its proper subordinate role. The humans accepted these apologies with grace and humility. They did not mention that they were reading every private communication these officials sent. They did not reveal that they knew exactly how the Velkhari laughed about human weakness in their secure channels. They simply smiled and nodded and waited. Admiral Okonkwo met with Widow every week to review the operation's progress. "How much longer?" she asked him one evening, her voice calm but her eyes burning with the need for justice. "3 more months," he replied. "We need to be absolutely certain that every system is compromised before we act. If we move too early, they might find a way to regain control. We only get one chance at this." She nodded, understanding completely. "My daughter would have been 8 years old next week," she said quietly. The Admiral placed a hand on her shoulder. "We will honor them all," he promised, "not with destruction but with something far more meaningful. We will make sure this never happens again, to anyone ever." Widow looked at the holographic display, showing the spreading network of human infiltration programs. "The Velkhari wanted to teach humanity a lesson about power," she said. "They are about to learn that they misunderstood us completely." And across the void of space, the Velkhari continued their celebrations, completely unaware that the humans they had dismissed as broken cowards were about to demonstrate a form of warfare the galaxy had never seen before. High Sovereign Zethal the Eternal awoke in his palace on Velkhari Prime to the strangest sensation he had ever experienced in his long life. Silence. Not the ordinary silence of a quiet morning, but a complete and terrifying absence of the constant hum that had been with him since the moment of his birth. The Nexus mind, the heartbeat of his civilization, the network that connected every Velkhari to their society, had gone silent. He reached out with his mind to access his personal systems and found nothing. He tried to activate his communication devices, and they did not respond. He attempted to open the door to his chambers, and it remained sealed. For the first time in his entire existence, the High Sovereign of the Velkhari Dominion was completely and utterly alone. Across 12 star systems, 400 billion Velkhari experienced the exact same moment of horrifying isolation. Ships that had been traveling through space found themselves unable to navigate or communicate. Factories that had been producing goods shut down completely. Doors that separated rooms and buildings and cities refused to open. Financial systems that tracked every unit of currency froze solid. And most terrifyingly of all, the reproduction chambers that maintained the species' population cycles went offline, their delicate biological processes suspended. The Velkhari were not destroyed. They were simply stopped. In every city on every world across the entire Dominion, Panic began to spread as people realized they could not do anything without the network that had always supported them. Some tried to force doors open with their powerful claws and found that the reinforced materials would not yield. Others attempted to use manual overrides that had not been activated in thousands of years and discovered they had forgotten how. The Velkari had built their civilization on technology, and now that technology had been taken from them. Then the screens activated. Every display surface across the Dominion suddenly glowed with the same message, written in perfect Velkari script that showed the humans had studied their language with terrifying precision. "You killed our children while shaking our hands," the message read. "Now your civilization belongs to us. Not destroyed. Taken. Every secret, every shame. Every lie, we have it all. Your history is ours. Your future is ours. You wanted humanity broken. Instead, you gave us everything. The United Human Federation." Zethal stared at the words glowing on his chamber wall and felt something he had never experienced before. Fear. Not the mild concern of a leader facing a difficult decision, but the deep and primal terror of a creature that has suddenly realized it is completely at the mercy of something it does not understand. He had ordered the deaths of billions of humans, believing he was teaching them a lesson about power. Now he understood that he had never known what power truly meant. On Earth, in the command center of Project Seizure, Fleet Admiral James Okonkwo watched confirmation signals arrive from every infiltrated system across the Dominion. "Total network control confirmed," reported one of his officers. "Every major system is locked under our authority." "Reproduction chambers?" he asked. "Suspended but stable," came the reply. "The biological processes are paused, not terminated. We can restart them at any time." The Admiral nodded with grim satisfaction. This had been one of the most difficult ethical debates during the planning of the operation. Some had argued that controlling the enemy's ability to reproduce was too extreme, a form of genocide by another name. But the decision had been made to include this capability not as a weapon of extinction, but as a guarantee of compliance. The Velkari would not be sterilized. They would simply understand that their very future as a species now depended on human approval. "Open a channel to the Galactic Council," the Admiral ordered. Moments later his face appeared on screens in the great chamber of Concordia Prime, where delegates from across the galaxy had gathered in emergency session to respond to reports of catastrophic system failures across the Velkari Dominion. "Distinguished representatives," Admiral Okonkwo began, his voice calm and measured despite the historic nature of what he was announcing. "1 year ago, the Velkari Dominion launched a treacherous attack on 7 human colony worlds, killing 2.3 billion of our citizens. They targeted civilians deliberately, striking hospitals and schools and homes rather than military installations. They committed this atrocity while their leader shook hands with our ambassador and spoke of peace." He paused to let his words sink in. The Galactic Council called for measured response and diplomatic dialogue. "Humanity has done something different. Under Article 7 of the Concordia Conventions, which permits the seizure of enemy assets as war reparations following unprovoked attacks on civilian populations, the United Human Federation has enacted lawful seizure of all Velkari technological infrastructure." Shock rippled through the chamber as the implications became clear. "We have not destroyed their worlds or exterminated their people," the Admiral continued. "We have simply taken control of every system their civilization depends upon. Their ships cannot fly without our permission. Their doors cannot open without our approval. Their economy cannot function without our authorization. And their species cannot reproduce without our cooperation. He leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Within the hour, we will release complete evidence of Velkari war crimes to all member species. This evidence includes communications proving the attack was planned months in advance, recordings of military commanders celebrating civilian casualties, and documents showing their intention to eventually terraform human worlds for their own colonization. We do not seek genocide. We seek justice. And we have taken the means to ensure that justice will be served." The council chamber erupted in chaos as delegates shouted questions and demands and protests. But Admiral Okonkwo simply ended the transmission, having said everything that needed to be said. On Velkari Prime, High Sovereign Zethal finally managed to reach his war council through a communication channel that humans had deliberately left open. "What is happening?" he demanded. "How did the humans do this?" "We do not know, High Sovereign," one of his generals replied, terror obvious in his voice. "Our security experts are completely baffled. They say the infiltration must have been occurring for months, perhaps since before the attacks themselves. The humans have been inside our systems all this time, watching us, listening to us, copying everything." "That is impossible," Zethal roared. "Humans are primitive. They could not possibly possess the technology to accomplish this." "And yet they have," the general replied quietly. Zethal fell silent as the truth finally penetrated his arrogant certainty. He had underestimated humanity in the most fundamental way possible. He had assumed that because humans were physically weaker and technologically younger than the Velkari, they were inferior in all ways. He had never considered that humans might simply be different, that their strengths might lie in areas he had never thought to examine. Patience, he realized now. Planning, adaptation, the ability to transform grief into cold and methodical purpose. These were the weapons humans had used against him, and he had never seen them coming. In the command center on Earth, Widow watched the feeds from Velkari Prime with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something more complex. "We have them," Admiral Okonkwo said to her, "every single one of them." "Now the real work begins," she replied. "Seizure was only the first step. What we do next will determine whether we are conquerors or something better. What we do next will honor the dead or betray them." She turned away from the screens showing terrified Velkari citizens and looked at the Admiral with eyes that had seen too much loss to ever be truly warm again. "Let us show the galaxy what humanity does to those who betray our trust. Not destruction, transformation." And across 12 star systems, 400 billion Velkari began to understand that their universe had changed forever. The Great Tribunal Chamber on Concordia Prime had been expanded to accommodate the largest audience in galactic legal history, and representatives from every known species filled the seats to witness what the news networks were calling the trial of the age. High Sovereign Zethal the Eternal sat in the defendant's position, his once-proud posture now bent with the weight of his situation, his gleaming black chiton seeming dull under the harsh lighting of the court. Beside him sat 17 members of his high command, the generals and admirals and ministers who had planned and executed the attack on human colonies. They were not bound or restrained in any physical way. There was no need. Every system they might have used to escape or resist was controlled by humans, and everyone in the chamber knew it. The chief prosecutor rose to begin the presentation of evidence, and she was a face that Zethal recognized all too well. Ambassador Elena Vasquez, the woman whose hand he had clasped while signing a treaty he had never intended to honor, now stood before the galaxy to ensure he faced justice for what he had done. She no longer used the codename Widow, having set aside that identity now that the operation phase was complete. But the loss that had transformed her remained visible in her eyes, a cold fire that would never fully fade. "Distinguished judges," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "over the next several days, we will present evidence demonstrating beyond any possible doubt that the Velkari attack on human colonies was not a spontaneous military action or a defensive response to perceived threats. It was a carefully planned genocide, approved at the highest levels of their government, designed not to achieve any strategic objective, but to inflict maximum suffering on civilian populations." The holographic display above the chamber activated, showing communications intercepted by human infiltration programs during the months before the attack. "This recording was captured 3 months before the Taetti Accord was signed," Elena explained. The voice of High Sovereign Zethal filled the chamber. "The treaty is irrelevant," the recording played. "We will sign whatever the humans want, smile for their cameras, and then strike when they believe they are safe. Target their breeding centers especially, their schools and hospitals. Kill enough of their young, and they will lose the will to challenge us ever again." The chamber fell into horrified silence as the recording continued, revealing conversation after conversation in which Velkari leaders discussed their plans with casual cruelty, laughing about how easily humans had been deceived, debating which civilian targets would produce the most psychological damage. One recording showed a general asking whether they should spare human children under a certain age. The High Sovereign's response was immediate and brutal. "Children grow into adults who remember. Kill them all." Delegates from species across the galaxy listened with growing disgust as the evidence mounted. Species who had considered the Velkari allies found themselves questioning every interaction they had ever had with the Dominion. Species who had feared Velkari power now looked at the defeated Emperor with contempt rather than terror. And species who had privately admired the attack as a bold move against upstart humanity now understood that they had been supporting something truly monstrous. The trial continued for 11 days, with evidence covering not just the attack itself, but the Velkari's long-term plans for humanity. Documents revealed that the Dominion had intended to systematically reduce human population through repeated attacks until the survivors could be enslaved. Scientific reports showed research into biological agents, specifically designed to target human genetics. Colonial planning documents discussed how human worlds would be terraformed for Velkari habitation once the native population had been sufficiently reduced. By the end of the trial, there was no question of guilt. The only question was what would happen next. The tribunal rendered its verdict: guilty on all charges of crimes against sentience, unprovoked genocide, violation of sacred diplomatic trust, and conspiracy to commit extinction. High Sovereign Zethal was sentenced to life imprisonment on a human station, where he would be treated humanely, but would be forced to watch as everything he had built was dismantled and rebuilt. His generals and ministers received similar sentences, each one carefully designed to ensure they would witness the transformation of their civilization. But punishment was only part of humanity's response. Under the terms of the seizure protocols that had been established during Project Seizure, humans now had the legal authority to restructure Velkari society to prevent future atrocities. This was the most controversial aspect of the entire operation, and debates raged across human space about whether it was right to impose changes on another species. Some argued that humanity had become the very thing they claimed to oppose, conquering and controlling others simply because they had the power to do so. Others pointed out that the Velkari had demonstrated they would commit genocide if given the opportunity, and that leaving their society unchanged would simply guarantee future massacres. In the end, the decision was made to proceed with restructuring, but with important limitations. Humans would not rule the Velkari directly. Instead, they would work with reformers within Velkari society, individuals who had long opposed the Dominion's brutal policies, but had been too afraid to speak out. These brave souls had provided crucial assistance during the infiltration, and now they would help build something new. The propaganda networks that had taught Velkari citizens to view other species as inferior were shut down and replaced with educational systems that presented accurate information about galactic history and culture. Military hierarchies that had concentrated power in the hands of aggressive expansionists were dissolved and rebuilt around civilian oversight and defensive doctrines. The rigid caste system that had divided Velkari society for 10,000 years was gradually dismantled, allowing individuals to pursue their own paths rather than being locked into roles determined by birth. Economic systems were reformed to reduce the power of the old noble families who had supported the war. Legal frameworks were rewritten to protect individual rights that had never existed under the Dominion. And most importantly, the Nexus Mind was restructured to prevent any single authority from ever again having the ability to control the entire species. It was difficult work that would take years to complete, and there were setbacks and resistance and moments when the whole project seemed doomed to fail. Some Velkari refused to accept the changes and formed resistance movements that attempted to restore the old order. Others embraced the reforms so enthusiastically that they pushed for changes even humans thought were too extreme. And many simply tried to survive and adapt, uncertain what their future held. Alina Vasquez served as the chief liaison between human administrators and Velkari reformers, using her diplomatic skills and her deep understanding of the stakes involved to navigate countless crises. She gave the closing statement at the tribunal, looking directly at Zethal as she spoke. "You thought that slaughtering our children would break humanity," she said, her voice steady despite the grief that still lived within her. "You misunderstood us completely. We do not break. We adapt. We remember. And when we are wronged, when trust is betrayed in the most terrible way possible, we do not respond with blind destruction. We respond with something far more thorough." She stepped closer to the defendant's position, close enough that she could see her own reflection in his compound eyes. "You are not being executed, Zethal. Your species is not being exterminated. Instead, you will spend the rest of your very long life watching your empire transform into something you would never recognize. Something better. Something that will never threaten innocent people again." She turned to address the broader chamber. The galaxy needed to learn what happens when you betray humanity's trust. Not annihilation, but transformation. Not revenge, but justice. And a lesson that will never, ever be forgotten. The chamber was silent as she walked away, and Zethal the Eternal was led to the ship that would carry him to his prison, where he would indeed spend decades watching everything he had built be rebuilt by the very species he had tried to destroy. 10 years had passed since the day humanity seized control of the Velkari Dominion, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Velkari Republic, no longer permitted to use the word Dominion, had become one of the most remarkable success stories in the history of interstellar civilization. A generation of young Velkari had grown up under the reformed educational system, learning true history rather than propaganda, developing relationships with other species rather than being taught to despise them. These young people viewed the old empire with a mixture of shame and disbelief, unable to understand how their grandparents had supported such cruelty. Trade flourished between human and Velkari worlds, with each species contributing unique strengths to shared enterprises. Cultural exchange programs brought young Velkari to Earth, where they studied at human universities and returned home with new ideas and lasting friendships. Human students traveled to Velkari academies to learn the advanced mathematics and engineering techniques that the insectoid species had developed over their long history. What had once been the most bitter enemies in the galaxy were slowly becoming genuine partners. The Galactic Council had changed as well, though in quieter ways. A new provision had been added to its charter, a clause that the diplomats had taken to calling the Human Provision, though it was never officially named. This provision stated that any unprovoked attack on civilian populations by a member species would be met with a proportional systemic response, as determined by the affected party. The language was deliberately vague, but everyone understood what it meant. No one wanted to find out what humanity might do if betrayed again. Other species looked at the humans with a new kind of respect, though respect mixed with something that might have been fear. The mammals who had seemed so young and naive had demonstrated capabilities that the galaxy had not known existed. They had taken an ancient empire and transformed it without firing a single shot. They had won the most complete victory in recorded history through patience and planning rather than destruction. And they had shown that they were willing to do whatever was necessary to protect their people. Several species quietly began reviewing their own relationships with humanity, ensuring that no misunderstandings or grievances might escalate into conflict. The humans noticed this, of course, but they said nothing. They simply continued to be friendly and cooperative and apparently harmless, exactly as they had been before the attacks. But everyone knew now that the appearance of harmlessness meant nothing. Fleet Admiral James Okonkwo had retired from active service 5 years after the seizure, his work complete and his health declining from the stress of the operation. He gave one final interview on the 10th anniversary of the attacks, sitting in his small home on Earth and speaking to a journalist who had traveled across the galaxy to hear his thoughts. "Do you believe humanity went too far?" the journalist asked. The admiral considered the question for a long moment before responding. "We did not destroy their worlds," he said slowly. "We did not exterminate their species. We did not torture or enslave them. We took control, held them accountable for their crimes, and then helped them become something better than they had been." He paused, looking at photographs on his wall, including one of a young man in a naval uniform who would never grow old. Could we have simply defeated them militarily and moved on? Perhaps, but they would have rebuilt their fleets and attacked again in a generation or two. The hatred would have festered and grown and eventually led to another war, and more children would have died. He turned back to the journalist. "We ended it. Not through destruction, but through transformation. The Velkari who exist today are not the same civilization that attacked us. They are something new, something that genuinely wants peace and cooperation. And that, I believe, honors the dead far more than any amount of revenge could have." The journalist thanked him and left, and the admiral returned to his garden, where he spent most of his days now, growing vegetables and enjoying the simple pleasures of a life that had known too much pain. On New Geneva, in the rebuilt city that had risen from the ashes of the massacre, a memorial stood in the central plaza. The names of every person killed in the attack were inscribed on walls of black stone, millions upon millions of names that would be remembered for as long as humanity existed. Elena Vasquez visited this memorial every year on the anniversary of the attack, though her hair had turned silver now, and her steps were slower than they had once been. She had resigned from diplomatic service 3 years ago, feeling that her work was finally complete. The Velkari Republic was stable and growing. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Her family had been avenged, not through blood but through justice. She stood before the wall where her husband's name was inscribed above her daughter's, touching the letters gently as she did every year. "It is done," she whispered. "We did what we promised. We made sure it never happens again." A sound behind her made her turn, and she found herself looking at a small Velkari child, probably no more than 6 years old by human estimation. The child was holding a flower, one of the native Velkari blooms that had become a symbol of remembrance in their reformed culture. "Is this the place where the bad things happened?" the child asked, her translator rendering the question in a high, innocent voice. Elena nodded, surprised by the child's presence. "Yes," she said, "many people died here." The child walked forward and placed the flower carefully at the base of the memorial wall. "We learned about this in school," she said. "My teacher said we should always remember so we never do bad things again." Elena felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched this small gesture of mourning from a member of the species that had killed her family. This was why they had done it this way, she realized. Not just to punish the guilty, but to create a future where such things could not happen again. Where children of former enemies would grow up learning to honor the dead rather than celebrate the killing. Where the cycle of hatred could finally end. "Your teacher is very wise," Elena told the child. The child looked up at her with compound eyes that held no malice, no hatred, only the innocent curiosity of youth. "Were you here when it happened?" she asked. "I was not here," Elena replied, "but I lost people I loved very much." The child reached out and took Elena's hand in her small claw, a gesture of comfort that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. "I am sorry," she said. "I hope you're not sad anymore." Elena looked down at this small being, this representative of a new generation that had been raised to be better than their ancestors, and she felt something shift inside her heart. Not forgiveness exactly. The wounds were too deep for that. But perhaps something like hope. "I am getting better," she said honestly, "and seeing you here makes me believe that the future will be bright." The child smiled in the way her species had learned to express happiness and ran off to rejoin her family, leaving Elena alone with the memorial and her memories. She looked up at the stars, visible even in daylight from this world, and thought about everything humanity had accomplished and everything they had lost and everything they had become. They had been betrayed in the worst possible way. They had responded not with destruction, but with transformation. They had turned their greatest enemy into their greatest proof of what was possible. And they had ensured that no species in the galaxy would ever dare to betray humanity again. Not through fear of annihilation, but through the knowledge that humanity did not simply win wars. Humanity ended them. Forever. The memorial stood silent in the fading light, a testament to loss and justice, and the strange resilience of beings who refused to let tragedy define them. And across the galaxy, the story of what humanity had done was told and retold, becoming legend, becoming warning, becoming hope. The